January 17, 1944, a gray winter dusk settles over the fields outside Limoges, in occupied France. The wind crawls low across frozen furrows, lifting thin veils of mist that cling to the hedgerows. A tired sun sinks behind bare, black branches, casting long skeletal shadows across a narrow dirt lane. Along that lane, a tiny figure rides. The bicycle is far too small even for a child. Its frame chipped, its once bright paint dulled by years of use. The bell rattles with every bump, a faint metallic ring swallowed by the cold air. A wool cap is pulled low over a small face, cheeks red from the wind. His feet pump furiously on the pedals, boots caked with mud, scarf whipping behind him. He is 6 years old. His name is Marcel Pinte. To the passing German patrol, if they notice him at all, he is nothing more than a village boy, running an errand or playing at the edge of curfew. A child on a tiny bike, harmless, forgettable, but hidden in the lining of his coat. Carefully folded and slipped into a secret pocket stitched by his mother's trembling hands, is a message that will move men, weapons, and secrets across the invisible veins of the French resistance. The tiny bell on his bicycle rings once as he hits a stone in the path. That sound is his shield. The Gestapo will hear it again and again. And for months, they will never understand what it really means. The war in France had settled into a kind of brutal routine. By late 1943 and early 1944, the German occupation had become a suffocating presence in everyday life. Roadblocks, curfews, sudden raids, posters announcing executions, and the constant threat of denunciation turned villages into quiet, fearful stages where everyone pretended not to see too much. In this landscape of terror, the French resistance developed its own rhythm. Messages had to move silently. Couriers had to be invisible. Weapons had to be hidden in barns, under hay, behind false walls. Every journey could be a last one. The Gestapo had a clear expectation of what resistance looked like. In their reports and training notes, they imagined saboteurs as men in dark coats moving in the shadows, former soldiers, communist militants, Gaullist officers, priests who had turned subversive. They pictured conspiracies whispered late at night in back rooms and taverns. Their threat maps were covered in names of adults, coded networks, ranks, and aliases. What they did not picture was a 6-year-old child on a tiny bicycle, weaving between fields and farmhouses. Yet, in the countryside around Limoges, near the hamlet of WWII, this is exactly what emerged. A resistance role designed for someone so small that German suspicion slid past him like rain off a stone. There, on a modest farm, lived the Pinte family. The father, codenamed Athos, was a key member of the resistance. The farm was not simply a home. It was a clandestine nerve center. Hidden beneath hay, behind thick stone walls, and under floorboards were radios, coded messages, weapons, and men on the run. The house was a meeting place, a relay point, a transit station for those who chose to fight, and moving between these worlds, between field and farmhouse, between safe house and rendezvous point, was Marcel and his little bike. The German authorities believed they understood how to break France. They used fear, reprisals, deportations, labor conscription. They infiltrated networks, used informers, and cataloged suspicious adults. They expected resistance to be a question of hardened men and political ideology. What they did not expect was that one of the most effective careers in a local network would be a boy just barely taller than his bicycle's handlebars. The transformation of Marcel from child to messenger did not happen in an instant. It grew over months. In the quiet logic of a desperate war, the pine farm in WWII sat close to important routes used by McWizards, the rural resistance fighters who operated in forest and remote countryside. As German intelligence grew aware of resistance activity in the Hautvian region, local networks were forced to adapt. Communications had to be faster, quieter, more unpredictable. Adults on bicycles were being searched. Young men walking alone with satchels could be stopped at checkpoints and made to open their bags. Women, though often underestimated by the occupiers, were increasingly monitored in areas known for partisan activity, so the resistance did what resistance movements often do. It looked for the blind spots in its enemy's imagination. One of those blind spots was childhood itself. To the Gestapo, to Wehrmacht patrols, to German security services. Children were background figures, targets for indoctrination perhaps, but not agents of subversion. Their presence meant normal life, harmless routine. Marcel had grown up in a house where the language of secrecy drifted above his head like smoke. He heard the coded names, saw men arrive exhausted in the night, watched his father and others vanish for long stretches and return with faces set in grim lines. He saw the whispered conferences at the kitchen table, the way his mother's eyes moved to the door at every unexpected sound. Children are not blind. They absorb more than adults imagine. According to accounts later recalled by those who knew him, Marcel wanted to help. He followed his father, watched the comings and goings, learned the patterns. The resistance fighters, half amused and half uneasy, called him their petit soldat, their little soldier. Eventually, his role became more than affectionate teasing. His parents understood the risk. The Gestapo did not differentiate between ages when it came to punishment for terrorism, but they also understood another fact. In this harsh calculus of occupation, using every possible advantage could mean the difference between life and death for dozens, even hundreds of people. The tiny bicycle was already there. A simple object in a simple life, a child's means of play, of freedom in the fields. But war turned it into something else, a courier's tool, a symbol of defiance. Marcel's deliveries began small, short distances, simple messages, a folded scrap of paper to a neighbor's farm, a note tucked into a loaf of bread, a verbal phrase he had to repeat exactly. The rules were strict. He was taught not to look afraid, not to act secretive, not to rush. He had to be a child first, always. If a German soldier waved him down, he must smile, slow, answer simple questions, and never, ever touch the hidden pocket in his clothes. To anyone watching, he was just another boy sent on errands. Maybe his mother had run out of flour. Maybe his father needed help nearby in the field. The bicycle bell became part of the camouflage. It sounds small, metallic, innocent, was another layer of normalcy. Well, the Gestapo pored over maps and intelligence reports, trying to trace resistance lines through the region. Their attention was focused on rail yards, bridges, supply depots, and suspicious adults. They questioned mayors and priests, monitored post offices, and tracked radio signals. They plotted raids, burned farms they believed were hiding weapons, and sent men to labor camps and prisons. Meanwhile, a 6-year-old boy pedaled through their surveillance grid, unmarked and undetected. His routes expanded, farm to farm, hamlet to crossroads, house to barn. In the space of a few miles, he traversed frontiers of danger most men would have feared to cross, not because he did not understand the risk, but because his world and the adult world overlapped in a way that made him uniquely effective. On one hand, he was a child aware of danger only as something that could happen to others, not yet fully lodged in his own imagination. On the other, he was immersed in a home where that danger was fact, not phantom. Witnesses later described how naturally he moved around armed men, how comfortable he seemed among the maquisards. They called him a mascot, but mascots do not carry the future of operations in their small hands. Marcel did. His tiny bike, with its rattling bell and worn tires, cut through the cold air, the fields, the muddy lanes, over and over. Each trip was short, measured in minutes. Each one stitched another thread into the vast invisible web tying together men who refused to submit to occupation. The Gestapo, with all its files and informers, knew something was wrong. They knew messages were moving. They saw results, explosions on rail lines, ambushes, parachute drops met by prepared teams, weapons caches never quite where they expected them to be. They had lists of suspected couriers. On those lists were men and women with code names. There was no place for a -1-year-old with a tiny bike. As operations intensified in 1943 and 1944, the resistance in the region around Limoges became more deeply integrated into the wider Allied effort. Weapons and agents were dropped by night from British aircraft. Radio operators risked detection to transmit coordinates, intelligence, and requests. Each successful drop required timing, secrecy, and flawless communication among scattered groups. In such a system, delays or intercepted messages could be fatal. Children had occasionally carried notes or provided lookout roles in urban resistance activities, but in rural areas, the decision to formally use Marcel as a messenger was daring, even disturbing. It was a sign of how total the war had become. No life was completely outside its reach, yet this decision also reflected a hard, pragmatic understanding of the occupier's mind. The Gestapo had developed an expectation. Resistance meant adults, usually male, often in certain age ranges. Children were neither on their lists nor in their training manuals as threats to be watched. A boy on a bicycle did not fit the profile of an enemy. In that gap between expectation and reality, Marcel did his work. Imagine the smallness of the scene: a child's fingers numb with cold, fumbling as his father or another resistance member slips a folded sheet no larger than a few square centimeters into the hidden pocket of his jacket. A final glance, a hand on his shoulder, and unspoken understanding. Then the sound, the bicycle bell, ringing lightly in the yard as he starts to roll. To the adults watching, that sound is a knot of fear and hope. To the boy, it is simply the sound of going. In a war measured in artillery barrages, bombing raids, and battles involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, such details can seem insignificant. But history is altered not only by grand offensives, but by the successful delivery of a single piece of paper. German documents on counter-resistance operations reveal a fixation on breaking messenger chains. They describe searches for liaisons and links, and emphasize watching suspicious adults littering near known resistance areas. They advise patrols to pay attention to couriers passing between people's houses and farms. Nowhere in these texts is there guidance for stopping the small ring of a child's bicycle bell. It is one of the cruel ironies of totalitarian systems. They excel at anticipating grand conspiracies, yet falter in the face of simple human improvisation. The use of a child like Marcel did more than help messages move. It quietly changed how those around him saw the war. For the men of the Maquis, exhausted, hunted, and often hungry, his presence was a strange blend of comfort and pain. A child in their midst reminded them of the normal life that had been stolen from them: families, futures, ordinary days. At the same time, seeing him ride into a rendezvous point, pale hands gripping the handlebars, carrying news that would shape their actions, forced them to acknowledge how deeply the fight had entered the fabric of everyday existence. The war was no longer only at the front, or in the cities, or in the skies above. It was in classrooms, in kitchens, in small farmyards. In the clatter of a bicycle bell, German soldiers stationed nearby expected the war in France to be one of occupation duties, patrols, and occasional partisan skirmishes. They expected to face ambushes in forests, sabotage on tracks, maybe bombings in towns. They expected grown men with rifles. The reality was more insidious and far-reaching. The enemy they imagined was only a fraction of the enemy they actually faced. Resistance was not confined to fighters with armbands and guns. It flowed through civilians, through grandmothers hiding fugitives, priests passing silent blessings and warnings, children memorizing names and faces without understanding why they would later matter in trials and testimonies. Marcel's tiny bicycle, circling between the fields, embodied this shift. It was not just a courier's instrument. It became a symbol of how the war had seeped into the smallest spaces of childhood. The bell, when it rang, brought not the promise of play, but the promise of defiance under a regime that tried to control every document, every broadcast, every rumor. The simple sound of that bell became a quiet proclamation: messages still move. Freedom still speaks. The Gestapo considered themselves masters of detection. Their agents watched train stations, intercepted letters, and interrogated villagers, often with brutal methods. In regions with strong resistance activity, they organized raids designed to be sudden, overwhelming, and terrifying. They aimed not only to gather intelligence, but to break the will of occupied populations. In this environment, the pine farm lived under constant risk, the very qualities that made it a perfect resistance hub. A remote location, multiple outbuildings, fields that offered cover also made it a target for suspicion. Information, sometimes bought, sometimes coerced, sometimes whispered out of fear, slowly filtered into German hands. Names surfaced, place references appeared. Patterns began to emerge in their reports. The Gestapo did not know exactly what was happening at Gauberti, but they knew something was. They prepared. The raid that would ultimately change everything arrived like many others in rural France. Fast, loud, and merciless. German trucks lumbered along the same roads Marcel had ridden so many times. Soldiers piled out, boots crunching frozen dirt, weapons ready, eyes scanning for fleeing figures and hidden resistance fighters. They had a mental image of whom they were hunting, men in their 30s or 40s, perhaps teenagers, maybe a few women aiding them. They did not come looking for Marcel, they came looking for his father and the others. The details of that day would be recorded in fragmentary ways, in local memories, in sparse official notes, in the absence left behind. But the result was clear. The farm at Gauberti, once a place of movement and secrecy, became a site of sudden violence. In the chaos of the raid, shots were fired, bursts cutting into the air, into walls, into human bodies. It was in this storm of metal, noise, and panic that Marcel, the boy who had slipped between suspicion and danger for months, was struck and killed, 6 years old. A life that had carried messages and hope across fields ended in the very violence those messages had tried to navigate. The tiny bicycle that once rolled along muddy paths stood silent. Its bell, so often a symbol of movement and mission, hung still. The death of Marcel did something that the resistance often avoided. It forced people to confront not just the heroism, but the unbearable cruelty of their struggle. The resistance, though willing to celebrate adult martyrs, was more hesitant to speak loudly of children's sacrifices. After the war, stories of young couriers did emerge, but often wrapped in a kind of protective silence, as if saying too much would reopen wounds. Yet in the case of Marcel Pinte, the memory persisted. Those who had seen him ride, deliver, smile shyly among armed men, could not forget. His story spread first as a whispered lesson in the cost of defiance, then more widely as historians began to uncover the details of his role and death. The Gestapo, with all its power, had finally reached the small farm where messages, men, and weapons had passed. They destroyed lives and disrupted networks as they had intended to do. But in killing a 6-year-old messenger, they also revealed the depth of the enemy they faced. They had expected the resistance to be a secret army of hardened adults. What they encountered instead was a society in which even a child had chosen, or been required by circumstances, to participate in the fight. It was a sign that their projected total control, Germanization, and ideological conquest of France was failing at the most intimate level. They could censor newspapers, shut down radio stations, and deploy informers, but they could not completely extinguish the human urge to resist, not even in the smallest hearts. In the years after the war, French communities rebuilt. Plaques went up in villages. Names were carved into stone. Stories were recorded at kitchen tables. Marcel's name would appear among those of resistance fighters, a jarring presence, a boy, his age barely believable next to the word fallen. His role as a messenger, long underestimated, gradually gained recognition. Accounts emphasized the daring use of a child in a network, the way he had moved freely where adults could not, the months he had slipped through Gestapo attention. For the occupiers, whose ideology placed great emphasis on strength, order, and rigid hierarchy, the idea that a child could have fooled them for so long was almost unthinkable. Yet that is exactly what had happened. A 6-year-old, on a bicycle far too small, with a bell everyone heard and no one considered dangerous, had belonged to the inner ring of the enemy they had tried so hard to crush. There is a particular painful irony in the life of Marcel Pinte. In another time, in another country, a child like him might have been playing in a park, riding his bike through quiet streets, ringing his bell simply to hear the echo of its sound. His parents might have watched him from a window with ordinary worry, not fear sharpened by war, but in occupied France, childhood became a contested space. The Nazis pushed propaganda into schools, textbooks, and youth organizations. They wanted to shape minds, to redirect loyalty. The Vichy regime cooperated in many ways, hoping to preserve some measure of control by accommodating the occupier. The resistance countered in its own ways: clandestine pamphlets, underground newspapers, secret classes, and families who taught their children a different story than the one in official books. Marcel grew up hearing that story from the beginning. His tiny bicycle, a simple object of childhood, became a quiet answer to the occupiers' attempt at total control. While German officers inspected trains, measured production, and scheduled deportations, a small boy rode past their authority, carrying words they could not read and plans they could not foresee. In that contrast lies the heart of his symbolic power. The occupier expected obedience. The reality was defiance, carried even by those who should have been too young to understand. As Allied forces advanced across Europe after D-Day and resistance operations intensified, the work done by countless anonymous couriers, including children, became part of the hidden infrastructure of liberation. Without messages delivered, weapons placed, and rendezvous confirmed, many operations would have collapsed before they began. Marcel's small journeys were one thread in a vast tapestry, but they were no less real because of their size. The sound of his bicycle bell, echoing across those fields, can be imagined as a faint note in the larger symphony of resistance, a fragile, high pitch in the middle of a storm of artillery, engines, and marching boots. It is easy to overlook such a sound. The Gestapo did, and that was their mistake. Today, the story of Marcel Pinte challenges comfortable ideas about war, heroism, and sacrifice. It confronts the listener with uncomfortable questions. How far can a just cause demand sacrifice? Where is the line between courage and tragedy when a 6-year-old serves as a courier in a deadly underground struggle? Yet his life, brief as it was, also illuminates something enduring about the nature of freedom. Freedom, in times of darkness, is rarely defended only by soldiers in uniform. It is preserved by those who pass information quietly, who hide fugitives, who risk small acts that carry enormous consequences. It is defended by parents who choose to resist, even at terrible risk to their children. And sometimes it is defended by the children themselves. Marcel did not give speeches. He did not write manifestos. He did not hold a rifle in the forests with the Maquis. His weapon was movement. His battlefield was a few kilometers of dirt roads and farm tracks. His recurring symbol was that tiny bicycle, its bell ringing in the cold air. That sound, clear, thin, and easily ignored, embodies a deeper truth about how ideology meets reality. Totalitarian regimes like the Nazi occupation depend on the belief that they can control everything: borders, language, thought. They demand that people see only what they are told to see, fear who they are told to fear, and serve who they are told to serve. But the reality, then as now, is that human beings possess a stubborn capacity to resist control, sometimes in the smallest ways imaginable. A folded piece of paper slipped into a child's coat, a mother's trembling hand stitching a hidden pocket, a father's decision to trust a 6-year-old with critical messages, the clatter of a bicycle on a frozen road. The bell. To German ears, that bell meant nothing. It was background noise in a conquered land. To those waiting in barns, in woods, in hidden rooms, it was the sound of hope arriving. Each successful delivery strengthened the belief that occupation was not permanent, that the world might yet be remade, that the future could still belong to something other than fear. Marcel's death underscored the brutal cost of that belief. It showed that the struggle for freedom can demand the lives of those least able to understand the ideologies at stake. Yet his story also ensures that the occupation is remembered not only as a time of submission and terror, but as a time when even a child could quietly stand against the machinery of oppression. The tiny bicycle, standing silent after his death, becomes a monument in itself. Not in stone, not in bronze, but in memory. In its stillness, The viewer can almost hear the bell ring again, a single, clear note against the silence. In the end, the story of Marcel Pinte is not just about a 6-year-old French messenger who fooled the Gestapo for months. It is about what happens when a regime that believes in absolute control encounters a people who refuse, in ways both grand and small, to surrender their agency. It is about how the lines between childhood and adulthood, innocence and responsibility, can blur under the pressure of occupation. It is about the power of ordinary places, of farm, a field, a dirt road, to become sites of quiet heroism. Most of all, it is about the idea that freedom is not an abstract banner waved only by leaders and armies. It is a lived reality, defended in secret messages, in hidden radios, in whispered warnings, in the choices made by families at kitchen tables, and in the determined peddling of a child riding into the cold. The Gestapo, with their maps and files, could not imagine that such power could exist in someone so small. They looked for enemies in trenches, safe houses, and coded telegrams. They searched adults for weapons, questioned them for information, dragged them into interrogation rooms. They never thought to fear the sound of a bicycle bell, but history remembers every time that bell rings in the imagination. Rolling across those winter fields, it echoes a larger truth, that in the struggle between oppression and freedom, the forces of control may dominate the airwaves and the streets, but they do not fully own the human spirit. In that small gap, where a 6-year-old can carry a message past armed men without being seen, lives the enduring possibility of resistance. And within that possibility, however fragile, rests the hope that even in the darkest occupations, freedom can still find a way to move quietly, bravely on to small wheels.